It was a quiet evening in late autumn, and the sun was beginning to set behind the distant hills. Tom sat on the edge of the porch, fiddling with his fishing gear. The day had been long, and the idea of escaping to the lake for some peaceful fishing called to him. His wife, Sarah, stood in the doorway, arms folded. Concern etched on her face. "You shouldn't go, Tom. It's getting late," she said, her voice laced with worry. "You know what they say about the lake after dark." Tom laughed softly, shaking his head. "Sarah, it's just old stories. I'll be back in a few hours with enough fish for tomorrow. I've been fishing at that lake for years. Nothing's going to happen." Sarah's eyes darkened as she stepped closer. "It's not the fishing I'm worried about. People have seen things out there, strange things." He shrugged her off, kissed her cheek, and promised he'd be careful. Grabbing his gear, Tom headed out toward Silver Lake, the old secluded spot where he had fished countless times before. It was a short drive, but as he neared the lake, the air seemed to grow colder, and the sky took on a strange, ominous hue. The sun had all but disappeared, leaving only a faint glow on the horizon. When Tom arrived at the lake, it was eerily still. The water reflected the fading light of the sky like a dark mirror. He set up his equipment by the old, creaky dock, casting his line into the calm water. The sound of the reel spinning was the only noise, aside from the occasional whisper of wind through the nearby trees. He felt a shiver, but blamed it on the temperature. As he sat waiting for a bite, time seemed to stretch endlessly. Minutes felt like hours, and a creeping unease settled in his chest. He checked his phone. No signal, but it didn't matter. He figured he'd give it another hour or so. Suddenly, the line tugged hard, almost yanking the rod from his hands. With a grunt, Tom pulled back, expecting a large fish. But something felt off. The resistance on the line wasn't jerky, like a fish fighting against the hook. It was steady, as if something far heavier was dragging the line deeper into the lake. His heart raced as he struggled to reel it in, but no matter how hard he tried, the weight on the other end didn't budge. And then, as quickly as it had come, the tension vanished. The line went slack. Breathing heavily, Tom checked the hook. The bait was gone, but that wasn't what made his stomach drop. Hanging from the end of the line was an old, decaying locket, covered in slime and algae. He frowned, wiping it clean with the edge of his shirt. Inside, there was a faded photograph of a young woman, her eyes hollow, her face worn with time. The sight sent a chill down his spine, and he tossed the locket aside. Something about it felt wrong. The wind picked up, and Tom noticed the fog rolling in over the lake, thicker and denser than usual. It clung to the surface of the water, swirling like ghostly tendrils. Then he heard it. A soft splash. His breath caught in his throat as he scanned the lake, but nothing was there. Just ripples disturbing the glassy surface. But as the fog continued to thicken, something moved out of the corner of his eye. A shadow gliding just beneath the water, slowly rising to the surface. Tom froze, unable to believe what he was seeing. A woman, pale and soaked, emerged from the depths. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth twisted in a silent scream. The same woman from the photograph in the locket. She was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned dress, torn and ragged. Her skin was blue with decay, and her long hair floated unnaturally around her. Panic surged through Tom as he stumbled back, tripping over his gear and falling onto the dock. The woman's hollow eyes locked onto his, and she started moving toward him, walking across the water as if it were solid ground. "No, this can't be real," Tom muttered, scrambling to his feet, but the dock was slippery. His foot slid, and he fell hard, closer to the edge. The ghostly figure reached the dock, her footsteps now audible. The creak of the wood beneath her seemed to echo in the dead silence around them. Her hand reached out, pale fingers extending toward him. Tom's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his body felt frozen, paralyzed by fear. He finally mustered the strength to get up and sprint toward his car, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he fumbled with his keys, the air around him seemed to grow heavier, colder. He looked back only to see the woman standing at the edge of the dock, her mouth opening in a chilling, silent wail. With trembling hands, Tom started the car and sped away from the lake, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of his home, slamming the door behind him. His wife, Sarah, rushed over. "Tom, what happened? You're pale as a ghost." For a long moment, he couldn't find the words. His mind was racing, replaying the terrifying events. "It was her," he finally whispered. "The woman from the lake. She's real." Sarah's face went pale. "The stories. I told you not to go." For days after the incident, Tom couldn't shake the haunting memory of the ghost of the lake. He never returned to Silver Lake, and word quickly spread in the small town about what he had seen. Some believed him, others laughed, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. But Tom knew what he had witnessed that night, and the memory of that ghostly woman would haunt him forever. It was a quiet, chilly evening in a small, secluded village in Mexico. Tom, a sturdy, middle-aged man with a weathered face, was chopping firewood near his cabin as the sun began to set behind the hills. The orange and purple hues painted the sky, casting a somber glow over the lake nearby. It was a place Tom had always known to be peaceful during the day. But as night approached, an eerie calm seemed to settle over the water, bringing back old stories he'd heard from his grandfather. As he continued to chop, Tom was startled by the sound of laughter. He looked up and saw 3 boys approaching, clearly full of energy and excitement. They were Peter, David, and Lucas, 3 adventurous teenagers from the village. They had towels draped over their shoulders and were wearing swim trunks, obviously planning to go for a swim. "Where are you boys going?" Tom asked, his tone wary. "To the lake," Peter replied enthusiastically, as he gestured toward the darkening water. "We're going for a quick swim before it gets too dark." Tom's face turned serious as he laid down his axe. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he warned. "The sun is nearly gone, and the lake isn't safe at night." The boys exchanged skeptical glances, chuckling under their breaths. Lucas, the boldest of the 3, laughed and said, "Come on, Tom, you're just trying to scare us with old ghost stories." Tom took a deep breath and continued, "Listen, boys, this isn't a joke. There's a reason no one swims here after dark. They say that a woman's spirit haunts this lake, a woman who drowned here many years ago. Some say she's looking for revenge, while others believe she's trying to drag someone else into the water to share her fate." Peter rolled his eyes, trying to play it cool, but David's expression faltered. He had heard rumors about the ghost of the lake, but like any curious teen, he'd brushed it off as mere folklore. "We'll be fine," Lucas said defiantly, already taking steps toward the water. "We'll be quick, right, guys?" Peter and David exchanged glances and nodded reluctantly, following Lucas toward the shore. Tom watched them with a heavy heart, a sense of dread settling over him. He could only hope they would return safely. As the 3 boys splashed into the cold lake, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only the pale light of dusk. They swam out a short distance, laughing and joking, each trying to outdo the other with daring dives and splashes. But soon, a strange silence fell over the lake. The water seemed to turn darker, almost black, as if something was shifting beneath the surface. David shivered and looked around uneasily. "Maybe we should head back," he suggested, trying to mask the tremble in his voice. "Oh, come on, don't be such a chicken," Lucas teased, though his own voice was edged with nerves. He swam farther out, daring the others to follow. Suddenly, Peter noticed something odd in the water near Lucas. It looked like a pale shape, almost like a hand reaching up from the depths. Before he could call out a warning, the hand shot up, gripping Lucas's ankle tightly and pulling him downward. Lucas screamed, thrashing wildly, but the more he struggled, the tighter the grip seemed to become. David and Peter stared in horror as Lucas's head dipped below the water, only to reappear moments later, his eyes wide with terror. It's got me!" he cried, struggling to stay afloat. Without thinking, Peter and David swam toward their friend, grabbing his arms in a desperate attempt to pull him free. But the grip of the ghostly hand was unyielding, dragging him down with an unnatural force. For a moment, Peter caught a glimpse of something beneath the water. A woman's face, pale and twisted, with hollow red eyes. Her long, dark hair floated around her head like a halo of shadows, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. She locked eyes with him, and he felt a chill seep into his bones, freezing him in place. "Let him go!" Peter shouted, but his voice was swallowed by the water's eerie silence. Lucas's struggles grew weaker as the ghost pulled him further under. His last, desperate scream bubbled up to the surface before his head vanished below, leaving only ripples in the water. Peter and David were paralyzed by fear, watching as the water stilled, the surface smooth and silent, as if nothing had happened. Then, with a jolt, Peter regained his senses. "Run!" he screamed, grabbing David's arm and pulling him toward the shore. The two boys swam as fast as they could, their limbs heavy and their lungs burning. It felt like an eternity, but finally, they reached the edge of the lake, collapsing onto the shore, gasping for air. They looked back at the lake, half expecting to see Lucas emerge, laughing, telling them it was all a prank. But there was nothing, only the dark, still water, reflecting the night sky. A sick feeling settled in their stomachs as they realized Lucas was gone. The boys stumbled back to the village, soaked and shaken, their minds reeling from the horror they had just witnessed. They found Tom waiting for them, his face lined with worry. "Where's Lucas?" he asked, though he feared he already knew the answer. Peter, his voice barely more than a whisper, replied, She took him." Tom's face grew pale. "I warned you, didn't I?" he muttered, his voice filled with sorrow. "That lake, it doesn't let go." The villagers mourned Lucas's disappearance, though many believed he had simply drowned. Peter and David knew the truth, but they couldn't bring themselves to speak of the ghostly figure they had seen. From that day forward, they never returned to the lake, and neither did anyone else in the village. But, on quiet, moonlit nights, when the wind was still, some claimed they could hear a faint voice echoing across the water. A mournful wail, as if someone was calling out from the depths, forever searching for another soul to join her in the cold, dark embrace of the lake.
Edward was eager for a peaceful night in nature. He packed his gear at home, a small tent, his sleeping bag, and a few essentials, planning to camp by the lake that he'd heard was as beautiful as it was remote. With each passing day in the noisy city, he'd found himself longing for a place where he could clear his mind, hear his thoughts, and be at one with nature. The lake, surrounded by a dense forest and rarely visited, was exactly what he needed. Edward took the trail to the lake on foot. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm glow across the landscape. The trek was longer than he'd anticipated, winding through stretches of overgrown forest and quiet glades. After about an hour, Edward noticed an older man coming down the trail toward him. The man looked weathered, his face worn and rough, and he had a solemn look in his eyes. "Headed to the lake, are ya?" the man asked. Edward nodded, sensing the man's unease. "Yeah, planning to camp there tonight," he replied, trying to sound casual. The man introduced himself as Tom. "Young man, you don't know what you're getting into. You might want to reconsider camping by that lake." Edward laughed nervously, assuming Tom was trying to scare him with local ghost stories. "I'll be fine." Just need a quiet night. The lake sounds perfect for that. Tom's face darkened. Listen to me. There are things by that lake that no one can explain. They say at night you might see things, hear things. If you value your life, turn back now. But Edward was determined, brushing off Tom's warning as mere superstition. With a friendly nod, he continued toward the lake, his mind fixed on the peace and quiet he was sure to find there. He reached the lake around 5 p.m., and it was breathtaking. The water stretched out like a sheet of black glass, reflecting the towering pines that encircled it. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow over everything, and for a moment, Edward felt a rush of contentment. This was exactly what he'd been craving. Edward quickly set up his tent near the water's edge, built a small fire, and settled down to enjoy the scenery. As dusk fell, the lake grew quiet and still. The only sounds were the gentle lap of the water against the shore and the occasional rustle of the trees in the breeze. A strange stillness settled over the lake as night fully descended. By the time it was pitch black, Edward began to feel a chill in the air, but it was more than just the temperature. He felt an odd unease that he couldn't shake. He brushed it off as nerves, thinking of Tom's ominous warning. Around midnight, the lake seemed to change. A dense fog rolled in from the water, creeping onto the shore, swallowing up everything in its path. It was unlike any fog Edward had ever seen, thick and heavy, and as it grew, so did the silence. He couldn't even hear the water lapping anymore, just an eerie, dead stillness. Suddenly, Edward noticed something in the fog. At first, it looked like a shadow, barely visible through the thick mist. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, thinking it must be a trick of the light. But the shadow didn't disappear. Instead, it grew clearer. It was a woman. She stood on the surface of the lake, her figure ghostly and translucent. Her long white dress was soaked, clinging to her frame, and her dark hair hung wet and tangled around her face. Her skin was pale, almost bluish, and her eyes were a deep, unnatural red, like embers glowing in the darkness. Edward's heart pounded as he stared at her, frozen in terror. She was looking straight at him, her gaze piercing, cold, and filled with malice. She raised one hand, reaching toward him with fingers long and bony, dripping with water. He tried to look away, to scream, but he couldn't move. It was as if he were rooted to the spot, held captive by her stare. The air around him grew colder, and a strange sound filled his ears, a faint, mournful wailing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Leave," she whispered, her voice hollow, echoing across the lake. "This is not your place." But Edward couldn't move. His mind raced, but his body was locked in terror. She began to move closer, gliding across the water, her hands still outstretched, her red eyes never leaving his. As she approached, Edward felt an intense, unbearable cold seep into his body. It felt like ice crawling up his spine, tightening around his heart. He couldn't breathe. His chest felt heavy and his vision began to blur. She was closer now, so close that he could see the water dripping from her pale, lifeless face, could smell the musty, decaying scent that clung to her. The last thing Edward saw was her face inches from his, her lips parting in a twisted, malicious smile.
Before we get back to the story, don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. Otherwise, a ghost might just show up to give you a kiss tonight.
The next morning, a group of hikers found Edward's camp. His tent was still there, the fire had burned out, but he was nowhere to be found. They searched the lake's edge, calling out his name, but there was no response. When they reached the shoreline, they saw footprints leading to the water, stopping abruptly at the lake's edge. No sign of struggle, no indication of where he'd gone, just those eerie, solitary footprints. Tom heard about Edward's disappearance later that day and shook his head sadly. He had tried to warn the boy, But some things couldn't be explained, only feared. The lake had taken Edward, just as it had taken others before him. And in that small village nearby, people knew better than to venture near the lake after dark. As night fell, a few villagers claimed to see a figure by the lake, barely visible through the fog. A young man standing silently at the water's edge, looking out across the dark, still surface. And on some nights, if you listened closely, you could hear the faint, sorrowful sound of his voice mingling with the cries of the lake ghost, both forever bound to the waters of that cursed lake.